Welcome. My name is Donovan Tindill. I'm the Director of OT Cybersecurity at DeNexus. I've been in OT Cybersecurity for about 25 years. About 17 of that has been a consultant doing everything from design, integration, deployment, security assessments, and all kinds of different verticals and industries. So I'm going to bring forward to you my experience as a consultant trying to help my customers understand and manage risk. My talk is going to be about the cyber physical balance sheet. So managing OT cyber risk, looking at insurance, and then also how that ties into resilience in my talk. So how are entities managing OT cyber risk today? I looked across different guidelines, standards, and recommendations from 62443, NIST, CISA, Australia, UK, and I looked at what were the top recommendations. And this word cloud is going to look very familiar. You see at the top of the list, network segmentation, remote access, multi-factor authentication. These are the top recommendations that organizations should have. And then as you advance your cybersecurity program, you start crossing them out and you work your way through the different controls if you were to follow the guidance given to you. So how effective is this approach in the boardroom? So put yourself into this seat, and this is a technology or a topic that you're not familiar with. These words, these phrases, they mean nothing. All they look like is cost. So you imagine how effective is it when you come into a meeting and you say, we've completed these security controls and these are the next ones in line, and you wonder, how would that work? Is it going to work? In the boardroom, it's about financial risk management. They're looking at revenues. This is money coming in and revenues that they can make. It's about expenditures, the costs that are going to eat away at those revenues. And then overarching, managing different types of risk, operational, regulatory, market changes, financial risk. So when you bring a list of security controls, how does that look when you try to bring that into this conversation? What security teams present is they bring counts of vulnerabilities. They look at pen test findings, maturity framework, incident volumes, different metrics, audit results, and of course, mitigation projects. As you can see, the word cloud at the bottom. But what the boardroom is really looking for, they're not looking for these technical metrics or a list of technologies. They want to know, one, how much does this technology cost us? And we, as security professionals, that's pretty easy to do. But they also want to know, how much would a major cyber incident cost? If the organization experienced an incident now, how much would it be? What is the probability of that happening? And if they grant that security spend, how much return are they going to get, and how does it compare to other risks? Because if you a technical control is very different than saying we're going to go deal with equipment maintenance, other types of traditional business initiatives. And then lastly, if we were to have a loss, how would we reserve some cash or insure against it? Today's cybersecurity conversation is dominated by costs. That's what these technology lists are. This is what it looks like in the boardroom. What it's missing is the incident impact, the cost of a breach, outage, physical event, quantified in dollars, not in heat maps, not a ranking 1 to 5, not a traffic light, yellow, red, green. Also, the loss reduction ROI. If this budget is granted to give and move ahead with a cybersecurity project, if we were to have an incident, how much would that loss be reduced? And you can use that information to help prioritize and justify those budgets. And lastly, risk transfer. You buy down risk and you start thinking about, could I transfer some of this to an insurer in order to share or recover some of those costs? Here, I'm going to give you a sense of the cost of OT cybersecurity incidents. So what are the financial impacts of a cybersecurity incident? We're familiar from an IT incident, data breach, privacy costs, commercial fraud. Both IT and OT, they share different financial losses, including proprietary data loss, business interruption, extortion, response, reputation, bricking, and different types of penalties. But unique to control system environments is that cyber physical boundary. You're now dealing with a physical asset where you can lose view, control, you can manipulate view, and you can have control manipulated. And when that happens, you have loss of view, loss of protection, and this is where the financial impacts start to come in. The product you're producing becomes waste. You may release something into the environment, and there's now environmental penalties that goes with that. It could lead to human injuries, fatalities, regulatory, for safety and industry, equipment damage, and the worst, fire and explosion are the financial impacts that come uniquely from OT only. When we cross the cyber-physical line, this changes the loss equation. So in an IT-only impact, ransomware, data breach, fraud, reputation damage, here's some examples on the right that I looked up. On average, the initial ransom demand is like $1 million, but it's anywhere in the range of 0.1 to 10% of the annual revenues of the organization. Data is showing that the actual payouts are somewhere between $600,000 to $700,000 as actually being paid. Those that experience a ransomware event and are forced to pay, about 20% are forced to pay the ransom. And the long-term financial impacts, if you've ever seen an organization that's experienced a cyber attack, you look at their stock price and it'll take a dive, but then a little short while later, it'll recover like nothing ever happened. So there's deeper research that's looked that organizations' valuation against their planned returns are as much as 18% below their peers 2 years later. And that's just from an IT-only incident. The next boundary is OT disruption, where you bring in physical consequences, production shutdowns, waste materials, data loss, contractual, regulatory liability. Colonial Pipeline, the ransom that they were expected to pay was as high as 10% of their annual revenues, plus the shutdown. Clorox, another type of incident, when it was done, when you look at their financial statements over the 2 years later, it showed that it cost them about 6% of annual revenues. JLR, something more recently, as high as 3%, and the investigation is ongoing. And then if we look, these incidents continue to cross this line, with 76 in 2024 and 57 in 2025, where some kind of physical disruption of the control system occurred. Then there's the actual cyber-physical boundary where property damage occurs. This is where manipulation of control, loss of protection and safety leads to equipment damage, release, safety, etc. This is where the familiar Marucci, Polish Rail, Turkish Pipeline, Stuxnet, this is where they live, and the German steel mill. It hasn't happened very often, maybe 7 times in the last 40 years, but this is the line that we truly do not want to cross because the financial costs rise dramatically. What is cyber risk quantification? So using cyber risk quantification, what you're doing is you're simulating different types of scenarios, phishing, commodity ransomware, and then you move towards the higher impact, lower frequency, targeted ransomware, or directed OT cyber attacks, or something that's directly within that OT environment. And that other boundary we spoke about, that cyber physical catastrophe. When you model those scenarios, what happens is you're getting a loss distribution, not a single probability value. And this is the key difference that maybe quantification brings compared to traditional risk management, where you try to come up with a single probability value of how many times per year are we going to have an incident. Well, in actual fact, there's many different types of incidents, and they all have their different probabilities and impacts. But if you can model them all, you get that loss distribution, and you choose points off of that loss distribution, the annual mean, the 95th percentile, or that 1 in 20 year, that severe OT disruption event, and then that 99th percentile, that 1% chance, or 1 in 100 year, where the catastrophe occurs. Cyber risk quantification is very good at modeling scenarios where there's uncertainties or missing information and be able to come up with an estimation of what that potential loss might be. So with a cyber risk quantification baseline, and you have these points off of that loss distribution, now consider how you can monitor OT cyber risk. So here are some example values of the mean, 99th and 95th percentile. Once a month, on Super Tuesday, there's new vulnerabilities released, and then once they're present inside your environment, they're going to cause the probability of a potential cyber event to rise slightly because that probability of being able to get into that. And so with risk quantification, you're going to see the dollar level rise a tiny bit. You then follow on and you do your patching cycle, and so you can bring that risk back down because you've mitigated those vulnerabilities. Now imagine a scenario where the vulnerabilities that are present in your environment have major exploit activity. So it's not only low exploitability, it becomes much higher. The risk is going to jump right away because the probability and consequence are rising, and risk quantification is giving you that dollar line baseline of what is happening. Then you have the choice to do different projects, deal with the exploits, maybe different cybersecurity programs, improve incident response, or major security upgrades in order to remove some of that technical debt. But this is how you bring some timeliness, dynamism, and you can bring in telemetry as part of cyber risk quantification to have a financial dollar value that is representative of your OT cyber risk. So I want to explain the whole problem in one simple picture. So cyber risk management, when you put it into dollars, it's a capital allocation problem. You mitigate, retain, and transfer deliberately. We spoke about this loss distribution curve where you model different types of scenarios, your vulnerabilities, your cybersecurity program, these types of impacts, or the financial profile and revenues of your facilities. What happens if we look at the first part, which is retain, these are the cybersecurity incidents that are happening today. You're paying for them out of pocket. This is malware. This is a computer that shuts down, or something that you have to investigate, and your personnel are the ones who respond and do this. The next level is when something significant occurs and you're able to transfer that to a cyber insurance policy, and you're able to work with a partner on what that is going to be. And then the catastrophic scenario, which is that uninsured kind of tail. So with risk quantification, you actually have values in order to harmonize or at least evaluate if you're looking at what you're paying for out of pocket, what you could potentially transfer to an insurance party, an insurance partner, and that uninsured tail that might align with your risk profile. In this next section, I'm going to walk through different levers that you can use for risk management. The first is avoid, understanding risk before it needs to be managed. So what we want to do, and this is probably the most cost-effective, is to avoid risks altogether. So this is where security controls like don't put OT out on the internet without it being protected. You don't plug PLCs into the internet without a device or something to protect them. Changing default passwords, removing unnecessary software and services, reducing that exposure or attack surface, blocking outgoing traffic. The other thing to remember, though, these are cyber controls. Assume that any digital control can be modified. If it's programmed to protect your system, that protection can also be removed. So the other side of avoiding risk that I like to speak about is engineering controls, to actually have a cybersecurity mindset in the engineering of the control system with cyber-informed engineering, or CIE. It uses engineering to either eliminate or mitigate avenues for cyber-enabled attack, and it focuses on reducing consequence. There's many different types of engineered controls that you could implement, but what it's trying to do is that if that event, that cybersecurity impact, we're trying to prevent it or reduce the impact if it transfers over into that physical domain, so that it ultimately reduces the financial cost of that incident. And these are often some of the most effective ways of reducing financial risk. The second category is cybersecurity mitigation. This is identifying which controls deliver the greatest financial reduction per dollar spent. So with mitigating controls, the things you can do is you can use engineering and security controls. And there's 3 levers I like to talk about. One is the lever that reduces the frequency of those attacks happening. And this is really focused on probability. That if you can focus on controls that do that, it will have a financial benefit. The other is after the event occurs, where you want to shorten the outage duration. So detecting, responding, recovering quicker, that's going to reduce the severity. Think of it like a fire. Once you have a small fire, if you get it out right away, you really don't have impact. But if it's left and that incident is allowed to go on, obviously the duration and impact goes up as well. And the last is focused on consequence directly and mitigating that physical consequence. So these are levers that you can use to mitigate controls, and cyber-informed engineering goes there. So now, when you put this into risk quantification, you can measure different projects. So imagine 6 different projects listed here. They all cost $100,000, but you have a baseline profile of how much an incident would cost before and after that control is implemented. And what you can see is that certain projects will elevate out as having a better reduction of loss compared to others for the same investment. So I want to dig into one control a little bit deeper, which is OT incident response. So this is building on the SANS cybersecurity survey, and I looked into the different phases of the cybersecurity response, from compromise to detection, detection to containment, contain to remediate. And I looked at what was the benefit of each of those 3 projects or phases of the attack, and then also the cybersecurity maturity. And I want you to think of CMMI, or Capability Maturity Model. What I did is I started out with an organization that had 0 incident response capability. And what if they improved each of those incident response phases to the first maturity level, to be able to respond from maybe taking 18 months of dwell time and being able to get that down to below 6 or 1. The first one, because it's very much about building the program, it doesn't show a lot of benefit. But once you have your basic capability, maturity level 2, or being able to respond within 30 days, this is when the financial returns of improving incident response really start to show. And this is what financial quantification of risks helps us do, because it's focused on what would that impact be, and then as I improve my cybersecurity program, what are the returns that I'm going to get from this? And what we see is that the greatest financial gains are early maturity level improvements, but there's still good reductions, 50%, 30%, and 20%, to continually improve OT cyber incident response because of the financial benefits, because you detect, respond, and recover and get your facility back online faster. Another use case for financial quantification of risks is helping you look at this from a facility level and identify which facilities contribute the most financial risk to the portfolio. So imagine a list of facilities, different regions, different age of control system, different skills and strengths of personnel managing them, and you can bring that in, and not only the revenues of the facility, but then you can balance that with, are we protecting it well enough? And so another use case to look at mitigation and say which facilities may need more targeted cybersecurity investment where the risk is the highest. The next lever of risk management I want to talk about is transferring risk and looking at how much cyber insurance would be necessary, what limits, and what supports a renewal negotiation. With cybersecurity insurance, we want to decide what optimal coverage based on what the organization needs. So imagine a hypothetical scenario here with a deductible and an insurance limit. There's what we retain, the uninsured deductible underneath. These are losses that if they cost less than this, the company has to pay for. And then there's those that are above the limit. And for most, nobody really knows how to align this. If you can bring in a financial quantification baseline, you start to align potentially a coverage gap between your higher consequence 1 in 20 year, 1 in 100 year value at risk, and you say, okay, there's a potential gap here. What can we do about it? This is where you can leverage risk buy down, a project, a firewall, network segmentation, incident response, and you say, how much would that reduce a loss if we were to have a cybersecurity incident? And would it bring it in range of our insurance program? And this is giving you, for the first time, an ability to make that decision. Alternatively, you could go the other way. You could say, this is our risk. We don't want to spend money to buy down risk because of the capital cost up front. Perhaps we'll spread that out and we'll transfer it through premiums and better coverage. And one thing that's starting to happen in industry is that insurers are encouraging their customers to use risk quantification just so they become risk aware. I'm not saying that it's connected to any kind of premiums, but it is just simply the awareness of what cyber risk is and being proactive, that the insurance companies favor those who are thinking about risk in similar ways as they are. The next lever is accepting risk. To understand what residual risk, remember, financial loss that's on the balance sheet, that if it occurs, after mitigation and after transfer decisions are made. So here I want to show you the end-to-end example. We have a cybersecurity policy with a limit and a retention or deductible at the bottom end, but then we've also added into this a risk threshold, a certain amount of cash or investments that the company is willing to pay out of pocket over and above an insurance limit. We've also called this risk appetite. But for the first time, we're showing this in a dollar value. Like before, you look at your value at risk using risk quantification, and you identify, is there a risk gap between the insurance limit, what we would pay out of pocket, and where we sit in terms of our cybersecurity program and the financial losses that we could face. From a technical perspective, leadership can give the technical team some autonomy to decide how to buy down risk. And that's what the technical teams are very good at. So they can recommend several initiatives over a certain number of years and come up with a budget of how much that would cost. And then modeling it against the risk threshold and insurance limits to figure out where would that bring it down. So here's an example where the value at risk was actually twice as much as the project, meaning there was a return on mitigation greater than the cost of the project. Now, it might be $6 million in capital up front, but that potential for loss is gone forever. That's $12 million that's potentially lower next year and the year after and the year after. So think of it that way. And the last element is that if you make improvements and you choose to move ahead with that cybersecurity program, you want to work with your insurance partner and let them know about this annual progress, because you may be able to rediscuss and renegotiate different limits and premiums, because they favor and they look forward to and they want their customers to be managing their own risk, and they're going to try and work with you on that. To review the different levers, there's avoiding risk, to be able to identify and eliminate risk before it requires any type of management. There's applying mitigation controls to buy down risk, to prioritize different risk mitigation projects, different facilities, in order to help justify the budget and the return on those projects. You can transfer cyber risk through insurance and by coverage that aligns with your loss profile. And then lastly, the spot that we all want to get to, which is being able to accept risk. You've taken measures to avoid, mitigate, transfer. You know how much it's going to cost out of pocket, and you reach a position where you say, this is acceptable for now, and you continue to monitor the threat landscape, and then you make moves on these other levers as a result. Now, thinking back to that boardroom conversation where you brought forward a list of cybersecurity controls, now we're able to answer, how much would this risk cost to the company if an incident occurred? Which facilities are the greatest risk and need more attention? How does cybersecurity compare against other business risks like equipment maintenance, other kinds of financial costs, to be able to use dollar values and harmonize those? And then also, how much has risk changed over the last year? We've made improvements. What has happened to the threat landscape? For the finance team, how much capital should they reserve? How much budget? How could we account for it perhaps in mergers and acquisitions? And then also regulatory reporting. And then your insurance team, what limits make sense? What is the financial case for buying more or less coverage, etc. So this is the new types of conversations, or it's going to enable new conversations with your leadership team. I hope I've helped you better understand the cyber-physical balance sheet, how to better manage your OT cybersecurity risk, better understand cyber insurance, resilience, loss, and be able to bring that to that executive conversation and the different levers that you can pull in order to manage OT cyber risk in what I hope that you really are capable of doing, which is the missing link that I had when I was a consultant, 15, 20 years ago, is how to have a better conversation with your leadership to be able to get the right amount of resources to be able to manage OT cyber risk. If you would like a copy of these slides or additional papers that were used in the development of this, please scan the QR code there. And thank you very much.